A flight attendant harshly yells at a young autistic child on board, but just as the tension peaks, she discovers something that leaves her and everyone around her absolutely speechless. The twist? The child's family actually owns the entire plane. What unfolds next will completely shock you. But before we dive into the story, I'd love to hear where you're watching from today. Drop a comment below, and if you enjoy this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more incredible tales just like this one. The flight was smooth and the cabin was calm. Passengers were settled into their seats, seat belts fastened, and the soft hum of the plane was the only sound filling the air. However, one family, seated in the middle of the plane, was starting to feel the weight of the long journey. Their son, a young boy named Nathan, wasn't as comfortable as everyone else. Nathan had autism, and the overwhelming sensory input from the plane was beginning to affect him. He shifted restlessly in his seat, tapping his fingers on the armrest and making soft sounds to try to cope with the noise and movement around him. His mother, Mrs. Morgan, sat beside him, gently trying to soothe him. She handed him his favorite toy and adjusted his headphones, hoping they would help ease his discomfort. But as time passed, Nathan's anxiety intensified and his behavior became more noticeable. The sounds he made grew louder, catching the attention of several passengers nearby. That's when the flight attendant walking down the aisle noticed them. Initially, she didn't pay much attention, but as she walked closer and saw Nathan's erratic movements, her expression shifted to one of frustration. She stopped in her tracks, crossed her arms, and said, her tone sharp, "Excuse me, can you please keep it down? Other passengers are trying to rest." Mrs. Morgan looked up, startled and caught off guard. "He's autistic," she explained in a calm voice, "and he's struggling with the noise." But the flight attendant didn't seem to soften. She responded coldly, "Well, that's not my problem," her eyes narrowing as she glanced at Nathan. "We all have to follow the rules. Can you control your child or not?" Mrs. Morgan took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. She knew Nathan didn't understand these social cues, and adjusting to the chaos of the airplane was challenging for him. Still, the flight attendant wasn't backing down. "You can't just let him make noise like this," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. Nathan, confused by the growing tension and the harsh tone, began making louder noises, his small hands clutching his ears in distress. It was clear the situation was escalating, and the discomfort of everyone around them was palpable. Mrs. Morgan desperately tried to reassure Nathan, but the strain of the confrontation proved too much for him. "Please," she said softly, "just give us a moment. He'll calm down." But the flight attendant wasn't having it. "You should have prepared better if you knew your child couldn't handle this," she said, turning on her heel and walking away, muttering under her breath. The tension hung heavy in the air, and Mrs. Morgan, feeling the weight of the entire plane's judgment, could only watch as the interaction left her feeling helpless and frustrated. Mrs. Morgan could hardly believe what had just happened. She quickly scanned the cabin, noting how the other passengers began to fix their eyes on the unfolding drama, some with uneasy expressions, others with barely concealed irritation. The air was thick with anticipation, as if every soul was collectively holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable next move. Just when she thought matters could not deteriorate any further, another flight attendant arrived silently and positioned herself nearby, her presence adding another layer to the mounting tension. Meanwhile, the first attendant continued her measured pacing along the aisle, her gaze unwavering as it focused on Nathan, whose distress escalated with each passing second. As the situation spiraled, Mrs. Morgan stole a glance toward the cockpit door, yearning to catch the attention of someone who might step in to restore order. She recognized that although the chaos was beyond her control, she was not to blame. The flight pressed on as she struggled to soothe Nathan, even as every gentle word seemed only to intensify his agitation. His tiny hands clutched the armrests with increasing desperation, and his wide, bewildered eyes betrayed a deep, growing fear. It was as if he were trapped in a maelstrom of overwhelming noise and speed, with none of their familiar calming techniques capable of breaking through his escalating anxiety. In the midst of this, the flight attendants maintained a vigilant watch, their annoyance evident as they observed the disruption unfolding in the rear of the plane. A few passengers exchanged low, hushed comments, while others merely stole sidelong glances, each silently hoping that the commotion would somehow subside. The weight of their judgmental stares pressed down on Mrs. Morgan, amplifying her feeling of isolation. Despite her best efforts to manage the crisis, she had envisioned a smooth journey, yet now each passing minute seemed to drag her deeper into an unwanted battle for control. With every moment that Nathan's behavior worsened, her efforts to placate him fell short. It was painfully clear from the impatient look of the flight attendant who had already confronted her that no amount of explanation would alter her mind. Mrs. Morgan took a deep breath and whispered a few more calming words to her son, but the flight attendant was already approaching them again, her steps quick and decisive. "You need to get control of your child now," the flight attendant said, her voice sharp. "If he can't settle down, I'll have to move you to another seat, away from the rest of the passengers." Mrs. Morgan tried to explain again, her voice trembling, but the flight attendant wasn't listening. It was clear now that the flight attendant had made up her mind. The child's behavior was unacceptable to her, and she wasn't interested in hearing any more excuses. At that moment, Nathan began to cry out loudly, his anxiety overwhelming him. His cries filled the cabin, and it seemed like everyone was watching, waiting for something to happen. The flight attendant turned on her heels and walked away, shaking her head in frustration. Mrs. Morgan sat there, speechless, feeling both helpless and angry. She wanted to tell the attendant that she didn't need her judgment, that she was already doing everything she could to help her son, but the words didn't come. She just held Nathan close, trying to comfort him in the chaos. The tension hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Morgan wasn't the only one who noticed how the rest of the passengers had started to grow restless. Some passengers began casting disapproving glances her way, while others exchanged hushed, anxious whispers that filled the cabin with a palpable tension. She longed for a way to mend the mounting chaos, but each attempt to restore order only deepened her sense of helplessness, as if every effort stirred the storm even more. She desperately wished for the flight to end quickly, unaware that the next few minutes would completely upend everything. As Nathan's heart-wrenching cries echoed relentlessly through the cabin, the pilot's voice resonated over the intercom, announcing that they were approaching the halfway point of the journey. For most travelers, it was just another routine update, but for Mrs. Morgan, it marked an eternity since the turmoil began. With trembling hands, she tried to rock Nathan gently. Although the crushing stress was visibly draining her, she could see the flight attendants from the front exchanging furtive, worried glances and soft whispers, intensifying the weight of every judgmental stare from other passengers. Just as she braced herself to try and soothe Nathan once more, the cabin door near the cockpit swung open and the captain stepped out. He strode purposefully down the aisle toward her row, his discerning eyes scanning every face as if searching for the root of the disturbance. The flight attendants instantly straightened their postures and murmured among themselves, a silent acknowledgement of his commanding presence. Pausing at the front of the plane, he conferred briefly with a senior attendant, his calm authority infusing the air with a quiet resolve. Mrs. Morgan watched the subtle interaction with rising anxiety, noticing how the crew's earlier dismissive attitudes had given way to a nervous anticipation. Then, with measured determination, the captain turned toward her, his gaze steady and filled with quiet assurance. As he reached her row, he stopped, offered a polite nod, and said, "Ma'am, I'm the captain. I understand there's been a bit of a disturbance back here." Still on edge, she managed a slow nod before replying, "Yes, my son. He's having some difficulty with the flight. He has autism, and sometimes it's hard for him to adjust to the noise." His expression softened immediately. He glanced momentarily toward the front, where the flight attendant still lingered with uneasy looks, and then returned his full attention to her. "I can see that you're doing your best, but it's clear that there's been some misunderstanding with our crew," he explained in a calm, measured tone. After a brief pause to absorb the intensity of the moment, he continued, "I think it's time for us to clear this up." Mrs. Morgan looked at him, confused yet hopeful for an explanation. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. The captain exchanged a knowing look with the attentive crew before lowering his voice further. "You may not know this, but your family is very important to this flight. In fact, this plane belongs to you." His words hung in the air like a surreal proclamation. In that instant, even the formerly strict flight attendants appeared uncertain, their earlier harshness melting away under his calm authority. She had no idea who she had been talking to, or how much she had just messed up. The realization hit Mrs. Morgan like a wave, and for a moment she just sat there, staring at the captain. Her heart was racing, and she struggled to process what he had just said. "My family owns this plane," she repeated, her voice shaky. The captain nodded again, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Yes, ma'am, this plane is part of your family's private fleet," he said. "I understand the situation now, and I'm very sorry about what's happened here." He gestured towards the flight attendants who were now standing at the front of the cabin, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Morgan glanced back at the attendants, who were suddenly avoiding eye contact. The once confident flight attendant who had scolded her and Nathan earlier was now visibly flustered. She was shifting her weight from foot to foot, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation now that the truth was out. Mrs. Morgan could see the change in the air, a shift from tension to disbelief. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, still trying to wrap her head around the words. "Why would you treat us like this if you knew who we were?" The captain's face tightened slightly, as though he had been expecting this reaction. "I can't explain her actions, but I will certainly be addressing this with the crew after the flight. No one should have treated you like that, especially under these circumstances. I want you to know that this is not the standard for how we treat our passengers, no matter who they are," he said. Mrs. Morgan let out a slow breath. Her anger and frustration had reached a boiling point, but now, hearing the captain's words, she felt a bit of relief. Still, the damage had been done. Nathan, still distressed, was now pulling at his mother's sleeve, his anxiety only increasing in the midst of the awkward conversation. The captain noticed this and turned back to the front of the plane. "I'll make sure we give you some privacy for the rest of the flight," he added. "Please let me know if there's anything I can do to make things easier for you and your son." Mrs. Morgan nodded, but her mind was still swirling with what had just happened. She had been made to feel like an inconvenience, as if she were the one at fault for her son's condition, and now she was hearing that they were more than just passengers. They were the owners of the plane. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. As the captain turned to leave, Mrs. Morgan gave him a weak smile. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt hollow after everything that had unfolded. The captain gave a brief nod before walking back to the cockpit, leaving the flight attendants to deal with the aftermath. But it wasn't over yet. Mrs. Morgan could feel her frustration bubbling again. She had been put in a situation where she had to defend her son, but more than that, she had been made to feel small. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. As the captain disappeared into the cockpit, Mrs. Morgan turned her attention back to the flight attendants. They were still standing at the front of the plane, exchanging glances, but none of them dared to approach. It was clear they didn't know how to handle the situation now that the truth had come out. For a moment, Mrs. Morgan considered confronting them, but then she looked down at her son, still visibly distressed, his small body wriggling in her arms. She knew she couldn't deal with this in front of everyone. Instead, she focused on calming Nathan, her hands gently brushing his hair back as she whispered reassurances to him. Slowly, his breathing began to steady, though his eyes still looked confused and uncertain. The stress of the situation had left him exhausted, and he leaned against his mother's shoulder, finally starting to settle down. Despite the tension in the air, Mrs. Morgan managed to take a deep breath. The captain had apologized, and while that didn't undo the damage, it was a start. She tried to push the anger and frustration out of her mind and focus on getting through the rest of the flight, but it wasn't easy. She knew that once they landed, things would have to change. She couldn't let this incident slide, as there were serious issues with how the crew had handled the situation. Not long after, the senior flight attendant approached cautiously. Her steps were slow, almost hesitant, and Mrs. Morgan didn't even look up at first, as she wasn't interested in any more excuses. The flight attendant stood by her seat, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, but it took a few moments before Mrs. Morgan finally met her gaze. "I'm sorry," the flight attendant said softly, almost nervously. "I didn't know. I shouldn't have said what I did." She shifted uncomfortably. "I was just trying to maintain order in the cabin, but I was wrong." Mrs. Morgan didn't respond immediately. She could hear the apology, but it didn't feel genuine. It felt more like an attempt to smooth things over, to make everything seem fine now that they knew who she was. But for Mrs. Morgan, the apology didn't change the fact that she and her son had been treated unfairly. She took a moment before speaking. "You were rude. You treated us like we were causing a problem when we were just trying to get through the flight like everyone else. It wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about understanding." Her voice was steady, though her anger simmered beneath, and that was what was missing. The flight attendant looked down, clearly embarrassed, and Mrs. Morgan could see the guilt in her eyes. "I understand now," the attendant replied in a quiet tone. I will make sure something like this never happens again." But Mrs. Morgan wasn't sure that was enough. She could see that the attendant felt bad, but that wasn't going to fix what had happened. It wasn't going to make Nathan's anxiety disappear or erase the hurt that had been caused. She wanted more than just an apology. She wanted real change. "We'll be talking to the airline when we land," Mrs. Morgan said firmly. "I don't want this to happen again to anyone else. You need better training. All of you need to understand what it's like to travel with a child who has autism." The flight attendant nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes, of course. I'm so sorry," she repeated, then turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Morgan to think about the rest of the flight. The rest of the journey was quiet. Nathan had fallen asleep in his mother's arms, exhausted from the emotional strain. The tension between the flight attendants and the passengers seemed to lift slightly, though Mrs. Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had been made to feel like an outsider, and even though the captain had apologized, the entire experience had left a bitter taste. As the plane began its descent into their destination, Mrs. Morgan looked out the window, thinking about what would happen next. This wouldn't be the last time she'd stand up for her son. and it certainly wouldn't be the last time she'd demand respect for him and others like him. But for now, she focused on the one thing that mattered most: getting Nathan off the plane and into a calm environment, away from the judgment and misunderstanding of the past few hours. The plane began its descent, and Mrs. Morgan sat quietly still, holding her son in her lap. The lights in the cabin dimmed, and the usual hum of the aircraft intensified as they approached the airport. But despite the routine of the descent, the atmosphere in the cabin felt far from normal. There was an uncomfortable silence that hung over the passengers, as if the entire plane was collectively holding its breath. The incident earlier in the flight had caused ripples, and it was clear that not everyone had fully processed what had happened. Mrs. Morgan glanced around. A few passengers had already turned their attention back to their books or screens, but there were others who still seemed unsettled. She could feel their eyes, though no one was daring to stare directly at her. They had witnessed what had unfolded between her and the flight attendants, and some were undoubtedly wondering what would happen next. It was hard to shake the feeling of being on display. The flight attendant who had initially approached them with the harsh tone had disappeared for most of the rest of the flight. The others kept their distance, as if unsure how to act now that the truth was out. Mrs. Morgan was left in a state of conflicted thoughts. She knew she needed to stay calm for Nathan, but inside, she was angry. The whole situation had been mishandled from the start. She had expected a more professional response from the crew, especially when it came to handling passengers with special needs. The truth was, people like Nathan didn't always fit into the neatly structured world of air travel. It wasn't just the flight attendants who needed to understand. It was everyone. As the plane descended lower, Nathan stirred in her arms, blinking sleepily. His face still had traces of the earlier distress, but he seemed less agitated now that the worst of the flight was behind them. His tiny hand reached up and touched Mrs. Morgan's cheek, and she smiled softly, brushing his hair away from his face. The weight of the situation was heavy on her heart, but for now, Nathan's calmness was enough to steady her. She could think about what to do next once they were on the ground, but the thought of speaking to the airline about this incident lingered in her mind. She had been through enough of these types of interactions to know that it wouldn't be easy. The airline would likely try to sweep it under the rug, offer some platitudes, and promise that training would be improved. But she knew better than to take that at face value. She wanted real change. Something that would make a difference not just for her and Nathan, but for every parent traveling with a child who had autism or any other special need. It wasn't enough to apologize. The airline needed to acknowledge their failure and put the proper measures in place to make sure no one else had to experience what she had just gone through. As the plane touched down with a soft thud, Mrs. Morgan tightened her grip on him, holding him close as the seatbelt sign blinked on. The flight attendants had resumed their duties, preparing the cabin for landing, but there was no sign of the captain anymore. Mrs. Morgan looked out the window, watching the ground approach. Her thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let this go. The incident had to be addressed, not just for her family, but for everyone else who might face the same judgment, the same misunderstanding in the future. Once the plane had fully landed and taxied to the gate, the usual rush of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts and gathering their belongings began. But Mrs. Morgan stayed in her seat for a moment longer, still holding Nathan, who was now half asleep on her lap. She wasn't in a hurry to leave. She had things to do before she could walk off that plane. One of the senior flight attendants came down the aisle again, this time with a much softer expression. She paused at Mrs. Morgan's seat, looking unsure but determined. "Ma'am?" she started, her voice quietly. I just wanted to say again how sorry we are for the way things were handled earlier. It was unacceptable, and I'll make sure to pass on the message to the airline. We don't want to treat anyone like that." Mrs. Morgan nodded, but she didn't immediately respond. The apology felt a little hollow. She had heard it before, and it wasn't enough. Still, she appreciated the fact that the attendant seemed more sincere this time. "I appreciate your words," Mrs. Morgan said, her voice calm but firm. "But what happened today can't be brushed aside. I'll be contacting the airline to make sure this is addressed properly." The flight attendant nodded, looking genuinely concerned. "I understand. We'll do whatever we can to help with that," she said, hesitating for a moment, then added, "I really do hope things get better for you and your son. No one should have to go through something like this." Mrs. Morgan gave a small, tight smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, but it's not just about me. It's about making sure no one else feels like this. I'll be making sure the airline takes this seriously." With that, the flight attendant walked away, leaving Mrs. Morgan alone with her thoughts. The plane had come to a full stop, and passengers were now lining up in the aisle to deplane. Mrs. Morgan gently shook her son awake and carefully began to gather their things. It was time to get off the plane, but she knew this was far from over. Once they were off this flight, her work would begin. As she stepped into the aisle with Nathan in her arms, she couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. This had to change, it had to, and she would make sure it did. As Mrs. Morgan made her way down the aisle, she could still feel the weight of the entire situation pressing down on her. The flight attendants had stepped back, their faces unreadable, as passengers shuffled past. There was a distinct tension in the air, a lingering discomfort that seemed to be shared by everyone, even if no one spoke about it openly. Nathan, now wide awake and holding on to his mother tightly, could sense the unease around them, but he was far more focused on his own needs. His fingers played with the fabric of her jacket, his eyes darted from face to face, trying to make sense of the world around him. As they reached the door and prepared to step off the plane, Mrs. Morgan took one last look around. She could see the flight attendants talking in low voices, avoiding her gaze, but she didn't care. The apology earlier had been too little, too late. It wasn't just about a few harsh words. It was about a system that didn't understand, didn't accommodate, and, more than anything, didn't care. Once they were in the terminal, Mrs. Morgan moved quickly. Her feet carried her toward the exit. She needed to get out of the crowded space, away from the noise and the bright lights. She was done being watched, done being judged. But at the same time, she knew that the real challenge was just beginning. She couldn't walk away from this without making sure that something changed. She had seen firsthand how a lack of understanding could affect families like hers. This wasn't just about her son. It was about everyone who didn't fit into the mold of the perfect traveler. They reached the baggage claim area and Mrs. Morgan paused for a moment, letting out a breath. She hadn't realized she'd been holding Nathan. He tugged at her sleeve, clearly wanting attention, so she bent down and gave him a reassuring smile. "We're almost there," she whispered to him, brushing the hair from his face. Nathan's small hand rested in hers, his fingers wrapping around hers like a lifeline. They were almost out of this mess, but the weight of the incident continued to hang over her. It wasn't just the flight attendant's treatment, though that was bad enough. It was the whole way things had unfolded. The lack of patience, the lack of understanding, the assumption that people could simply behave their way through situations like this. It wasn't just about one flight. It was about a broader culture, one where people with disabilities, particularly autism, were often overlooked or treated as if their needs were an inconvenience, and that wasn't something she was going to let slide. As they waited for their luggage, Mrs. Morgan pulled out her phone and began to compose an email. She knew she had to start documenting everything, getting the details down while they were still fresh. The airline needed to understand what had happened, not just the way their staff had handled the situation, but the lasting impact it had on her son. It was one thing for people to say, "I'm sorry," but it was another thing entirely to make sure that those apologies led to real change. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen, typing out a concise but firm message. She explained the entire ordeal, from Nathan's sensory overload to the way the flight attendants had treated them. She made sure to mention that even though the family owned the plane, it wasn't about the money or status. It was about respect and the dignity of all passengers. This wasn't something that should have been swept under the rug, and she wasn't going to let that happen. Once she finished the email, she hit send and sat back, her eyes still focused on the screen. She knew the email alone wouldn't change anything. She'd need to follow up, press harder, and make sure her voice was heard. But sending it felt like the first step toward doing something that mattered. Mrs. Morgan sighed deeply, feeling both exhausted and empowered. She had fought to keep her son calm through the entire ordeal, and she had fought to stay composed when everything seemed to be spiraling out of control. Now that the flight was over, she felt like she could finally breathe again. But it was a short-lived relief. She knew this would be an ongoing battle. The carousel finally started to turn, and their bags appeared. Mrs. Morgan grabbed their luggage, keeping her son close as they headed toward the exit. The airport was still noisy, still bustling with people rushing from gate to gate, but for her, the chaos of the terminal felt distant, like it belonged to another world. She was still stuck in the aftermath of that flight, still haunted by the way she had been made to feel. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them. Mrs. Morgan inhaled deeply, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. It wasn't much, but it was a small relief. She knew the work ahead of her wasn't going to be easy. She had already planned what she would do next: contact the airline's customer service, follow up with the complaint, escalate it if she had to. She wouldn't let this go, not when her son had been treated like that. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. This wasn't just about one flight attendant, or one misunderstanding. It was about a deeper problem. It was about the way society often overlooked the needs of people with autism. The misunderstanding wasn't just in the sky. It was in everyday life. It was in classrooms, at grocery stores, and yes, even on airplanes. Mrs. Morgan held Nathan's hand as they walked toward their car. "We're going to fix this, Nathan," she whispered softly, though he couldn't quite understand what she meant. This was only the beginning, and in that moment, as they stepped away from the airport and into the world beyond, she knew she had to see this through. Because if no one else would fight for the respect and dignity of children like Nathan, she would. As Mrs. Morgan drove home, the weight of everything still sat heavily on her chest. The quiet hum of the car engine was a stark contrast to the chaos of the flight, but it didn't bring the peace she was hoping for. The airport had been a small reprieve, a brief moment of escape. But the emotional toll of the entire situation was far from over. Every few seconds, her mind would flash back to the flight, to the way the attendants had looked at her and Nathan, as if they were the problem, as if they were the ones who didn't belong. She had kept her composure for as long as she could, but now that the physical stress of the flight was behind her, the emotional weight was settling in. She glanced at Nathan in the rearview mirror. He was quietly staring out the window, lost in his own world, his small fingers still grasping the toy he'd held tightly throughout the flight. His face was calm now, no longer showing the anxiety he'd had earlier. But Mrs. Morgan could tell that the events of the day had left their mark on him. He didn't understand what had happened, but he understood when things felt wrong, when the atmosphere was tense, and that in itself hurt her more than anything else. She wanted to protect him from the world, from the misunderstandings, from the people who couldn't see past his behavior, but it wasn't always possible. In fact, more often than not, she found herself having to explain things, having to stand up for him to make sure he was treated fairly. Today, for the first time, she had been forced to defend him in front of an entire flight crew, in front of dozens. The thought made her blood boil, even as she tried to maintain her composure behind the wheel. She knew the airline needed to hear her voice, and she would make sure of it. But what came next? What kind of impact would her complaint have? Would they truly listen? Or would they brush her off like so many others had done in the past? The idea of fighting the system was daunting, but she couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just about her son. It was about making sure that every child, every adult, every person who had ever been overlooked or judged unfairly for something beyond their control had a voice. She wasn't the first person to face this kind of treatment, and she wouldn't be the last, but she could make a difference. She had to. By the time they reached home, the streets were starting to quiet down. The rush of the day was over, and the evening had settled in. Nathan had already drifted off to sleep in his car seat, his head resting against the window, his soft breathing the only sound filling the space. His mother turned off the engine, the silence of the car offering a moment of reflection. She sat there for a while, staring at the empty road in front of her, letting her thoughts swirl. Tomorrow she would follow up with the airline. She would reach out to customer service, escalate the issue if necessary, and make sure that the crew was held accountable. But more than that, she needed to ask herself a hard question. What was she really hoping to achieve by all of this? Was it just an apology she wanted? Or was it something deeper? Something that would affect real change? It wasn't just about an apology for Nathan, it was about shifting the mindset. About making sure that airlines and other industries understood that children with autism, or anyone with a disability, weren't a nuisance to be dealt with or an inconvenience to be dismissed. They were people with their own unique needs, and they deserved to be treated with respect. With a deep breath, Mrs. Morgan unclipped her seatbelt and carefully lifted Nathan from his car seat. He stirred but didn't wake. She carried him inside, his tiny, light body in her arms, and gently placed him in his bed. She watched him for a moment, his small chest rising and falling with each breath, before turning off the light and closing the door behind her. For a few minutes, she sat in the quiet of the house, the weight of the day finally beginning to settle into a more manageable place. She knew there would be more battles to fight, more difficult conversations to have, but as she reached for her phone again to check her email and draft a follow-up message to the airline, she realized something important. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were countless other parents, countless other families who had faced the same frustrations, the same unfair treatment. She wasn't just advocating for Nathan anymore. She was advocating for all of them. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she began to type. I am writing to follow up on my complaint from earlier today. I want to make sure that this incident is not just swept under the rug, and that real action is taken to ensure that no other family has to go through what we experienced. My son, like many children with autism, needs to be treated with understanding, not scorn. I want to know what steps will be taken to train your staff to handle such situations more effectively, and how we can make sure this doesn't happen again. She hit send, but her mind was already racing ahead to what needed to come next. This was only the beginning. She couldn't let up now, not when she knew that real change was possible. The airlines and society in general needed to understand that autism wasn't something to be tolerated. It was something to be understood, respected, and accommodated. As she set the phone down, a new sense of determination washed over her. She would keep pushing. She would make sure that her son and children like Kim never had to endure such ignorance again. And if that meant taking on an entire industry, she was ready. Tomorrow, she would call again. Tomorrow, she would make sure the airline knew exactly how serious she was. And tomorrow, she would make sure that Nathan's voice, his story, was heard, no matter how much resistance she met along the way. The following morning, Mrs. Morgan woke up early. The house was quiet, the soft morning light streaming through the blinds as she sat on the edge of her bed, trying to gather her thoughts. She had barely slept the night before. Her mind was constantly replaying the events of the flight, wondering if she had done enough, if she could have handled it better, if there was more she could have said to the flight attendants or even to the captain, but she knew she couldn't change what had already happened. What mattered now was what came next. How she would turn this frustrating, upsetting experience into something meaningful, something that would spark real change. She glanced over at Nathan, who was still fast asleep in his room. She could hear the soft murmur of his breathing through the walls, and for a moment, a wave of gratitude washed over her. He was safe, he was home, and he was okay. But the reality of the situation was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened on that flight wasn't just a random incident. It was a reflection of a deeper, more pervasive problem. The lack of understanding, the assumptions people made about autism, the way children with special needs were often treated as burdens rather than understood as individuals with unique challenges. It was a problem that extended far beyond just one flight, one crew, or one airline. It was a societal issue, and she knew it had to change. After a few moments of quiet reflection, Mrs. Morgan stood up and moved toward the kitchen, preparing a cup of coffee. Her hands moved automatically, the routine grounding her as she allowed herself a brief moment of calm before the storm of phone calls and emails. As she waited for the coffee to brew, she took out her phone, opened her email, and reread the message she had sent to the airline last night. It was firm, clear, and to the point, but now that some time had passed, she wanted to make sure it wasn't just a complaint. It had to be a call for action. She sat down at the kitchen table, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, thinking about how she would phrase the follow-up message. She wanted to make sure the airline understood that this wasn't just about an isolated incident. It was about a lack of training, a lack of awareness, and a lack of compassion. It was about creating an environment where people, no matter their challenges, felt respected and supported. "Dear customer service," she began typing slowly but deliberately. "I'm following up regarding the incident I reported yesterday, involving my son Nathan, who has autism, and the treatment we received during our flight. While I appreciate the apology I received from the captain and the senior flight attendant, it's clear that the issue goes far beyond a single interaction. What happened to us is part of a larger pattern of misunderstanding that I see far too often in society, and it's something that airlines like yours can help address." She paused for a moment, reflecting on her words. She wasn't angry, not anymore, but she was determined. This wasn't about demanding retribution. It was about asking for a commitment to change. She wanted the airline to take a hard look at how they trained their staff, how they dealt with passengers with special needs, and how they could improve in the future. "I would like to know what steps will be taken to ensure that your flight attendants, pilots, and other staff are properly educated on autism and other conditions that may require special accommodations," she continued. I understand that it's not always easy to know how to handle such situations, but there is no excuse for making a passenger feel less than or unwelcome. I am asking for a concrete plan, a clear outline of how your airline will address this issue going forward." As she typed, her thoughts became clearer. She was no longer just a mother fighting for her child's dignity. She was speaking for a broader group of people. Every parent who had ever had to explain their child's behavior to a stranger. Every person with autism who had ever been treated as if they were a problem to be solved, rather than an individual to be understood. Finally, she added, "I would like a direct response from someone in leadership at your airline, someone who can explain how you plan to address this issue on a broader scale. This isn't just about one flight. It's about creating an environment where all passengers are treated with the respect they deserve, regardless of their disabilities." She reread the email and then hit send. Her heart was pounding a little faster. Now, it wasn't just about sending an email. It was about taking a stand. She knew that sending the email alone wouldn't be enough, but it was a start, and she was ready for whatever came next. After finishing her coffee, she picked up the phone, and she dialed the airline's customer service number. She had already made her complaint through email, but she knew the next step was to get someone on the phone, someone who could actually do something about it. The phone rang for a few moments before someone picked up, and the familiar sound of an automated voice greeted her. She selected the option to speak to a representative and was placed on hold. The minutes ticked by, but she didn't mind. She was ready to fight for change, no matter how long it took. When the representative finally came on the line, Mrs. Morgan quickly explained who she was and the incident she was referring to. She kept her voice steady, but there was an urgency in it. "I've already sent an email about an incident on my flight yesterday. I was hoping to speak with someone who can give me more information on how the airline plans to address this issue," she said, keeping her tone polite but firm. The representative took a few moments to review her information and then asked, "What exactly would you like to see happen, ma'am?" Mrs. Morgan paused for a moment, thinking. She could have asked for a simple apology, or for a small gesture to make up for the way she and her son had been treated, but that wasn't enough. "I want change, real change. I want a clear plan. I want this airline to commit to better training for its staff on autism awareness, on how to approach situations like mine with compassion and understanding. I want to know that my family and families like mine will be treated with the respect we deserve when we travel, and I want to know how you plan to make sure this doesn't happen again," she stated. There was a pause on the other end of the line before the representative responded. "I understand your concerns, ma'am, and I will make sure to pass them along to the appropriate team. It's important to us that we provide the best possible service to all of our customers." "I appreciate that," Mrs. Morgan replied, her voice still steady. "But I need more than just words. I need to know that something is being done, and I expect to hear back from you soon with a concrete plan." The representative assured her that she would receive a follow-up in the coming days, and they ended the call. Mrs. Morgan hung up, her heart still racing. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time since the flight, she felt a sense of control. She was doing something about it. She was making sure that this wasn't just another incident that would be forgotten. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction, and she was ready for the next one. The days that followed felt like a blur. Mrs. Morgan had already set her mind to pushing forward with her complaint, but the reality of what that would involve began to sink in. The more she thought about it, the more layers of this issue she uncovered. It wasn't just the flight attendants who were responsible for what had happened. It was the entire framework around how people with autism were treated, especially in public spaces like airports but she wasn't going to let herself get overwhelmed. This wasn't the first battle she'd fought for Nathan's well-being, and it wouldn't be the last. She spent the next couple of days gathering her thoughts, collecting stories from other parents she knew who had similar experiences. She reached out to support groups online, asking if anyone had faced discrimination or ignorance while traveling with children on the spectrum. It didn't take long before her inbox started filling up with responses. Some were heartbreaking stories of parents being thrown off flights, of families being forced to deal with overzealous security personnel, or flight crews that didn't bother to learn about autism before judging a child's behavior. Others were more hopeful stories of airline staff who had been compassionate, who had taken the time to understand and accommodate. Each response was a piece of a bigger picture, a larger movement that Mrs. Morgan was now a part of. She realized that this wasn't just her personal fight anymore. It was a fight for every family who had been misunderstood, for every person who had ever been seen as a problem because they didn't fit into the standard mold of normal behavior. By the end of the week, Mrs. Morgan had compiled a report. It wasn't just a letter to the airline anymore, it was a call to action, a demand for change that she could send not only to the airline but also to autism advocacy groups, disability rights organizations, and even government officials. She wasn't looking for handouts, she wasn't asking for sympathy. What she was asking for was respect, and for better treatment for people with autism, especially in situations like air travel, where the stress of the environment can exacerbate symptoms. And behaviors? She knew this wouldn't be easy. She had already braced herself for the possibility of the airline pushing back, but this time she had prepared herself for any response, positive or negative. She had decided that no matter how long it took, no matter how many hoops she had to jump through, she would make sure this issue didn't get swept under the rug. One afternoon, after having lunch with a friend who had shared a similar experience with her child on a flight, Mrs. Morgan received the follow-up email she had been waiting for from the airline. She quickly opened it, her heart beating a little faster. The email was from a customer relations representative, and it started with an apology. "Dear Mrs. Morgan," the email began, "again, thank you for reaching out to us and for your patience as we reviewed your complaint. We want to begin by expressing our deepest apologies for the way you and your son were treated on your recent flight. We take your concerns seriously, and we appreciate you bringing this matter to our attention." At first glance, it seemed like the usual company apology, the kind that was polite and professional but often felt empty. Mrs. Morgan braced herself, expecting to read more of the same hollow words she had seen in past complaints, vague promises of better service and customer care. But this time, there was more. "As a result of your feedback, we have initiated a review of our training materials and are in the process of implementing a more comprehensive program for all of our staff. This new training will focus on increasing awareness of autism spectrum disorder, as well as other disabilities that require specific accommodations. We are also incorporating new protocols for handling sensitive situations with empathy and understanding." For a moment, Mrs. Morgan felt a sense of relief wash over her. This was what she had been asking for, an acknowledgement that the training needed to change, that staff needed to be educated on how to approach passengers with autism and other special needs. But she couldn't let herself get too comfortable. She kept reading. "We understand that actions speak louder than words, and we are committed to taking the necessary steps to improve our service. As part of this initiative, we will be offering all of our flight crews additional resources on autism awareness and disability sensitivity." Additionally, we are introducing a new protocol that will allow passengers with special needs, like your son, to receive priority assistance if needed. We want to ensure that every passenger feels safe and respected while flying with us." The words were exactly what she had hoped to hear, but they were still just words. She needed to know what this would look like in practice. What would the training entail? How would the airline measure its success? How would they ensure that staff didn't just go through the motions, but actually understood the issues they were addressing? The email ended with a promise to reach out to her again soon for further follow-up and a brief offer of a travel voucher as a gesture of goodwill. Mrs. Morgan sat back, staring at the screen. The first part of her mission had been accomplished. They had acknowledged the issue, committed to a review of their training, and promised to do better. But she knew this couldn't be the end. She had been here before. Companies had made promises, sent apologies, but nothing ever truly changed. She couldn't afford to let them think that this was enough. Without hesitation, she started drafting her response. It was a polite but firm letter that thanked them for their commitment but asked for more details. She requested specific timelines for the new training programs, asked for transparency on how the airline would monitor staff compliance, and even suggested that the airline work with autism advocacy groups to create a framework for understanding disabilities in air travel. She knew that if she didn't keep the pressure on, it would be too easy for them to let this fade away into good intentions that didn't amount to anything. As she hit send, Nathan came into the room, tugging at her sleeve, ready for his usual afternoon snack. His face lit up when he saw her, his small hands holding onto the toy he'd taken from the flight. Mrs. Morgan smiled, and she pulled him onto her lap, feeling the weight of the day lift just a little. She was making progress, but she knew there was still so much more to do. There were meetings to be had, policies to push for, and awareness to raise. But for the first time in a while, she felt like she was heading in the right direction. Nathan's world might be full of challenges, but it was also full of potential. And now, more than ever, she felt ready to fight for that potential. To make sure that one day, Nathan could travel the world without having to face the ignorance and misunderstanding that had greeted them on that flight. She wasn't just doing this for him, she was doing it for all the children like him, and that was worth every ounce of effort. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and follow-ups. Mrs. Morgan threw herself into the task at hand with a determination that surprised even her. Each morning she woke up early to check for any updates from the airline, scanning her inbox with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had received an initial acknowledgement from customer service, a polite email assuring her that her concerns were being taken seriously and that action was being taken behind the scenes. But promises on paper didn't always translate into real change. She wasn't about to let them off the hook just yet. She made regular calls to the airline, speaking to anyone who could give her more information. Each time she asked the same questions. When would the new training be rolled out? What specific resources would be included? Would this training be mandatory for all staff, from ground crew to flight attendants? And, perhaps most importantly, how would they ensure that their staff was not just aware of autism and other special needs, but capable of handling those situations with real empathy? The answers were often vague, but over time she started to see a shift in how the airline was responding. They didn't just offer apologies anymore, they began to give concrete timelines. Within 2 weeks, they assured her they would be implementing a pilot program for autism awareness training for all flight attendants. After that, they would be expanding it to other parts of the airline's operation, including customer service representatives and gate agents. But despite these steps forward, Mrs. Morgan knew this was just the beginning. A few changes to training programs didn't guarantee that the culture of the airline would shift, or that every employee would embrace those changes. What she needed now was to ensure that the airline was genuinely invested in understanding the needs of passengers with autism, and that meant holding them accountable. She started looking beyond just the airline itself. If this was going to be a systemic change, it needed to be a broader conversation. Mrs. Morgan began reaching out to autism advocacy groups, disability rights organizations, and even lawmakers who had worked on issues related to accessibility in public accommodations. She learned about initiatives in other industries aimed at increasing awareness of autism, and she found out that some airlines had already begun similar programs. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she started drafting proposals for the airline to collaborate with experts in the field, as well as with advocacy organizations that could help shape the training curriculum. She didn't want them to just teach their staff the basics. She wanted them to have a deep, nuanced understanding of how autism affected behavior and what accommodations could be made to make travel easier for families like hers. As her research deepened, Mrs. Morgan began to realize just how much work there was to do. This wasn't just about one airline, it wasn't even just about air travel. It was about accessibility on a much larger scale, about how society as a whole still struggled to make accommodations for people with disabilities, especially invisible ones like autism. It was about changing perceptions, breaking down misconceptions, and demanding that individuals with autism be treated with dignity and respect wherever they went. One afternoon, after a long call with a representative from an autism advocacy group, Mrs. Morgan felt a shift in herself. She wasn't just reacting to the incident on the plane anymore. She was now actively involved in a movement to change how the world treated her son and children like him. For years, she had tried to make the world a safer, more understanding place for Nathan, but now she was realizing that change could be bigger than just her family. Mrs. Morgan started drafting a comprehensive proposal, one that not only addressed training for airline staff but also offered suggestions for policy changes at the government level. She wanted airlines, public transportation systems, and even theme parks to adopt standards for interacting with individuals with autism. There were already laws requiring accommodations for people with physical disabilities, but what about those with developmental disabilities? The law was behind in many ways, and she knew that the only way to close the gap was through persistent advocacy and collaboration with the right people. She spent hours writing, calling, and meeting with experts. It was exhausting work, but it felt important, like a mission. She began to realize that by taking this on, she was not just advocating for Nathan's needs. She was advocating for an entire community of families and individuals who had long been overlooked in the process. She began to feel like she was part of something bigger than herself, a movement that wasn't just about changing one company's policy, but about changing the way society approached autism and disability in general. But there were moments of doubt, too. Even as the airline assured her they were moving forward with their training program, Mrs. Morgan couldn't help but wonder if this was really enough. Was this the change she had been hoping for, or was it just a band-aid on a much deeper issue? She had learned over the years that promises from large organizations often didn't result in the kind of systemic change that was needed. She couldn't afford to stop pushing and let the momentum she had built slip away, so she pressed on. She began working with a coalition of disability advocates to propose a new set of guidelines for the airline industry, one that would specifically address autism awareness and provide a framework for training staff. The guidelines weren't just about teaching employees how to deal with passengers who had autism. They were about fostering a culture of respect and understanding. It was about creating an environment where staff were equipped to help, where families felt supported, not judged. Then, a few weeks after sending her follow-up email, Mrs. Morgan received a call from a senior executive at the airline. It wasn't someone she had spoken to before, but the tone in their voice immediately told her this wasn't just another customer service representative. The executive introduced themselves as part of a special committee created to address customer feedback on autism and accessibility. The call, as it turned out, was a direct result of her persistence. "We've been reviewing your suggestions, and we'd like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss how we can work together on some of the larger initiatives you've outlined," the executive said. "We think this could be a great opportunity to make a real, lasting impact, not just within our airline, but within the industry as a whole." For a moment, Mrs. Morgan was speechless. She had worked so hard to get to this point, to push past the bureaucracy, the walls of corporate indifference, and now, finally, it seemed like someone was actually listening. "I'd be happy to meet," she replied, her voice steady though her heart was racing. "I've been waiting for an opportunity like this. Let's make sure we get this right." As they set a date for the meeting, Mrs. Morgan felt a sense of accomplishment. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot, but this was a significant step forward. She could feel the weight of the past few weeks finally starting to lift. For the first time, she felt like she was not only fighting for Nathan, but for all the children who deserved better. All the families who had to face the world's indifference every day. Her work wasn't finished, but she was no longer fighting alone. The momentum was building. And with each step, the vision of a more inclusive world for her son and for so many others was becoming clearer. This was the kind of change that could echo across industries, across countries, and across generations. And for the first time, it felt like it was actually within reach. The meeting with the senior executive from the airline finally took place a week later. Mrs. Morgan had prepared for it as if it were a high-stakes negotiation. She had gathered everything: data from advocacy groups, feedback from other families, detailed suggestions on how airlines could improve their training, and even some studies that showed how companies could benefit from better understanding autism and other disabilities. She knew that the more prepared she was, the harder it would be for them to dismiss her concerns. This wasn't just about making noise anymore. It was about crafting a solution that could actually work, something tangible that could help shift the way airlines thought about passengers with special needs. As she walked into the hotel conference room where the meeting was being held, Mrs. Morgan could feel the weight of the moment. She was no longer just a concerned parent. She had become an advocate, a voice for countless others who had faced discrimination and misunderstanding. The room was sleek, with glass walls and polished wooden floors, but the business-like atmosphere didn't intimidate her. She had worked too hard for too long to let that happen. Now the executive, a man named Adam, greeted her warmly as she entered. "Thank you for meeting with me today," he said, his voice polite but warm. "We've been reviewing everything you've sent us, and I'm really impressed with how thorough you've been. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this." Mrs. Morgan nodded, offering a smile but keeping her focus sharp. "Thank you. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, about how we can make things better, not just for my son, but for everyone who's been in the same position." As they sat down, Adam began by acknowledging the airline's commitment to improving accessibility for all passengers. He spoke about the pilot program for autism training that was already underway, explaining that a number of flight attendants had been sent to specialized workshops on autism awareness and sensitivity. Mrs. Morgan listened carefully, but she wasn't satisfied yet. She had been promised these changes before, and though she appreciated the effort, she needed to hear more. "You've made a good start," she said. But what I'm asking for is more than just basic awareness. What we need is comprehensive, ongoing training. Something that really changes the way your staff sees passengers like my son. It's not enough to simply acknowledge autism. Your staff needs to know how to respond when a child is overwhelmed, when a passenger's behavior is misinterpreted, or when someone needs extra support. Adam listened attentively, nodding as she spoke. "I agree," he said. "We've realized that this is more than just about awareness. It's about creating a culture of understanding, and that's something we've only begun to address. We've been working on expanding the program, and we're looking at integrating more specialized training into our regular curriculum. I'll be honest, we're just beginning to understand the depth of what needs to be done." Mrs. Morgan pressed on. "It's great that you're working on expanding the program, but what's your timeline? How soon can you roll out this new level of training for all of your staff, and how will you measure success? It's easy to talk about culture shifts, but those don't happen overnight." Adam paused, clearly thinking carefully about her question. "You're right," he said. "It's not going to happen overnight, but we've already started integrating some of the training into our regular crew meetings, and we plan to roll out a more structured program over the next 3 to 6 months. We'll be working with autism experts and advocacy groups to make sure we're doing it right. As for measuring success, we're looking at customer feedback and employee surveys, and we're open to suggestions on how we can track progress." Mrs. Morgan felt a flicker of hope, but she still wasn't entirely satisfied. "I appreciate that," she said. "But feedback after the fact isn't enough. I want to see more proactive steps, like a designated point of contact for passengers with autism, a way for families to let your staff know about their child's needs before boarding. The system has to be more flexible. Your staff should know in advance if a passenger needs extra time, extra space, or a quieter environment. I don't want families to feel like they have to explain everything on the spot when the flight attendants are already overwhelmed." James nodded again. "I see what you're saying, and I think that's a great idea. We've been considering a system where passengers could opt in for specific accommodations when booking, so that information could be passed along to the crew in advance. It's something we could easily integrate into our booking system. I think it would make a real difference in helping staff respond appropriately." Mrs. Morgan felt a sense of progress. She wasn't getting everything she wanted, but she was hearing real solutions. That would be a good start. "But we also need your staff to understand that autism isn't one size fits all. Each person is different, and behaviors can vary widely. Training shouldn't be just about how to deal with a child who's having a meltdown. It needs to focus on how to recognize when a passenger is anxious, when they're struggling, or when they're overstimulated. It's about knowing when to step in and when to give someone space." James leaned forward slightly, his voice earnest. "I hear you, and I agree. I think part of what's been missing is that understanding. It's not just about what the symptoms are, but about recognizing the signs early, before they become an issue. That's something we're working on." He paused, then added, "I'd also like to extend an offer. Once we finalize the new program, we'd love for you to come in and meet with our training team. Maybe even help us with some of the curriculum. I know it would mean a lot to the staff to hear directly from someone with experience." Mrs. Morgan was taken aback by the offer. It wasn't what she had expected, but it was exactly the kind of collaboration she had hoped for. "I'd be honored," she said. "I think it could make a huge difference if we work together." As the meeting progressed, Mrs. Morgan and James discussed further ways to ensure that the airline's efforts would go beyond just policy changes and training programs. They talked about developing partnerships with autism organizations, creating resources for parents traveling with special needs children, and implementing a calm zone system at airports, quiet spaces where families could go if their child was feeling overwhelmed. By the end of the meeting, Mrs. Morgan felt a sense of cautious optimism. There was still a lot of work to be done, but the conversation had shifted from apologies to action. The airline was starting to take her suggestions seriously, and for the first time she felt like they were genuinely committed to making a lasting change. As she left the meeting, a new kind of energy stirred inside her. She wasn't just advocating for one child, she was advocating for an entire community. She knew it would take time, but today had been a significant step forward. She had helped create a dialogue that could transform the way airlines treated passengers with autism, and she wasn't about to stop now. The fight was far from over, but Miss Morgan felt like she was no longer alone in the fight. This was bigger than her family. It was a movement that could reach across the country, across industries, and change how people with autism were seen and treated. And for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful that they were finally moving in the right direction. The months that followed were a blur of emails, meetings, and constant follow-up. Mrs. Morgan had gone from being a concerned parent to an integral part of the airline's autism awareness program. The collaboration wasn't always smooth, but it was progress, and that kept her moving forward. The airline had rolled out the first phase of the new training, and she had been invited to meet with the flight attendants and ground crew in person to talk about her experiences and offer insights into how autism affects behavior. And travel. It wasn't a perfect system yet, but it was a start. As the pilot program began to take shape, she started hearing positive feedback. Staff were more mindful, more patient. They were beginning to understand how to approach situations without judgment, how to offer help without assuming a passenger's needs. There were still moments of miscommunication, but each time the airline responded quickly, using those moments as opportunities to improve. Mrs. Morgan had also reached out to other airlines, sharing her experience and offering to help them create similar programs. She had become a sought-after speaker at autism conferences, talking about the importance of disability awareness in public spaces, especially in air travel. Her story was no longer just about a single incident. It had become part of a larger movement to create more inclusive, compassionate spaces for families like hers. But despite the progress, there was always more to do. Mrs. Morgan knew that she had seen the difference her efforts had made, but she also knew that not every airline or public service had adopted the same changes, and not every family had the resources or platform to push for change the way she had. Still, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction when she saw the results of her hard work. One day, several months after the initial meeting with the airline, Mrs. Morgan received a call from the same executive, James. He sounded excited, which piqued her interest. "I have something to share with you," James said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "We've just finished our first round of employee feedback on the Autism Awareness Training Program. We've received overwhelmingly positive responses from our staff, flight attendants, pilots, ground crew, everyone. They say they feel more equipped, more confident in their ability to serve families with special needs. It's making a real difference in how they interact with passengers. And more importantly, we've received positive feedback from the families themselves. We've had families reach out to tell us how much the program has meant to them." Mrs. Morgan felt her heart swell. This wasn't just another empty promise or corporate speak. It was tangible, measurable change. Real progress was being made, and it was happening because of the effort she had put in. She had pushed through the frustration, the late nights, the doubts, and now things were different. "That's incredible," she said. her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so glad to hear that. I knew this was going to make a difference, but to hear it from the people who are actually on the front lines, that's what really matters." James continued. "We've also had some staff come forward with ideas for further improvement. We're even looking into adding more sensory accommodations in airports, quiet spaces for children to decompress before their flights, and some special seating arrangements for families that need more room." Mrs. Morgan smiled, a feeling of warmth spreading through her. It wasn't just the airline that had changed. It was the whole culture surrounding air travel for families like hers. It wasn't perfect, but it was better, and that was enough for now. "You know," James said, "we'd really like to honor your contribution to this initiative. We want to make sure that this change isn't just an isolated effort within our airline, but something that's seen as part of a larger movement across the industry. We've been thinking about creating an award for families or individuals who have made a lasting impact on the accessibility and inclusivity of air travel, and if you're open to it, we'd love for you to be the first recipient." Mrs. Morgan was taken aback by the offer. An award wasn't something she had ever considered. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it for her son, for every other family that had faced the same struggles. But hearing James's words made her realize something important. This fight hadn't just been about one airline or one flight. It had been about changing the way society understood autism, about ensuring that the world in every corner could be a little bit more accommodating. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little shaky. "But I'm not doing this for any award. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. I want to see change, real, lasting change. For my son, for families like ours, for everyone." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and then James replied, "I know, and that's exactly why we want to honor you, because you've made change happen." After they ended the call, Mrs. Morgan sat there for a while, reflecting on the long path that had brought her here. She thought about the early days when she had felt so alone, when she had been fighting a battle that felt insurmountable. She thought about the moments when it seemed like nothing was changing, and all she had were words of hope from people who didn't fully understand her struggle. But now, as she looked back, she saw how much had shifted. Not just in the airline industry, but in the way she saw herself. She had made a difference, and in that moment she realized that the work wasn't over. She had made huge strides, yes, but she was just one person. She was a small part of a much larger movement. A movement that was pushing for a world where understanding, inclusion, and compassion weren't the exceptions, they were the rule. As she walked into the living room, where Nathan was playing with his toys, she felt a quiet pride. He looked up at her and smiled, his innocent eyes lighting up as he reached out for his mom. "Can we go fly on a plane soon?" he asked, his voice filled with joy. Mrs. Morgan knelt down to his level and smiled, her heart swelling with love for the boy who had started all of this. "Yes, sweetie," she replied softly. "Yes, we can." And for the first time in a long while, she knew that the world was starting to change. One flight, one conversation, and one small victory at a time. The lesson from this story is the importance of understanding and being empathetic toward individuals with special needs, particularly children with autism. The story highlights that while communication and behavior challenges can make others uncomfortable, instead of judging, we should be patient and find ways to help. The fact that the family owned the plane didn't change the rude behavior of the flight attendants, showing that not everyone understands the importance of respecting and supporting others, no matter who they are. Faced with ignorance and discrimination, Mrs. Morgan didn't just stand up for her son, but also fought for change in the airline industry. pushing for a more inclusive environment for all passengers. This is a lesson in resilience, advocating for the rights of the vulnerable, and the need for training programs to raise awareness about special needs in society. Mrs. Morgan's efforts remind us that real change starts when we fight for those who are often overlooked. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.